Hello, my name is Roisin and welcome back to my channel. So I've talked before on this channel about how I'm not really a character-based reader, and I'm definitely not a plot-based reader. So I'm trying to think about what I actually am in terms of what I need when I read things. I've talked about being a reader who really appreciates a good setting in books, but I've also seen people on Bookstagram talking about books that are no plot, just vibes. And so I thought I would talk about some of my favourite books that I just love the vibe of, that don't necessarily have a simple or straightforward plot. Some of these are more plotty than others. Not all of them are completely psychologically based or esoteric or just plain weird. I think most of them are quite weird though, but it's something that I've been getting into recently. I did make a video fairly recently about weird girl books that are on my radar, which I will leave in the cards above, and this is kind of adjacent to that. It's not entirely weird girl books, although I would say some of them are. It's more that they are books where the vibe is the most important thing about them. So I've got 10 books that I love here, and let's get into them. The first one I wrote down is Lincoln in the Bardo by George Saunders, which is potentially one of the weirdest books I've ever read, and I absolutely loved it. This is a piece of historical fiction set on the day that Abraham Lincoln's son died of a fever during a party, and it's split between the real world, which is told in a series of historical sources, some of which are real and some of which are fabricated, in order to tell the story of the party and of Lincoln at the time, and the rest of which is set in the Bardo, which is a Tibetan Buddhist theory of the afterlife. It's kind of like limbo in Catholicism, in that people in this afterlife are often going off on to the future, but this is where they are stuck kind of in between the two, and this is based in the cemetery where Lincoln's boy is laid to rest. And yeah, it just involves him, the spirit of Lincoln's son, meeting a lot of different spirits from different points in American history. There is a lot of enslaved people who are spirits, and there are various different people who have died over the past century, I would say. It's not much older than that, and they just tell their life story, how they ended up there. But as it is set in the afterlife, there is a lot of very strange things that happen, and not really much of a plot. It's more kind of exploring the idea of what happens after death, of various different traditions and their ideas of death, and also of the time period of the late 18th and early 19th century in American history up until the 1860s, I think. It really goes into lots of different historical detail about enslaved people, about poorer working people as well, and there's a lot of like tragedy, but it is so strange and weird. It's really hard to describe what actually goes on in the Bardo, because a lot of it is not graspable, it's just vibes, but I really loved it. I think the writing is amazing. I think that if you listen to the audiobook, it's narrated by a full cast of very well-known actors. I really loved it. It's a really hard book to sell to anyone because it is so strange, but I love that about it. I thought it was so interesting, I thought it was really compelling, and I felt so immersed in it the whole time I was reading it. I think ghost stories are a thing that comes up quite a lot in terms of these Just Vibes books, and I enjoy a ghost story when it isn't a horror book. A literary ghost story is something that I've really been enjoying. So if you have any recommendations for literary ghost stories, please leave them in the comments down below. Number 2 on my list is Burnt Sugar by Avni Doshi, which I read very recently when I was reading Sad Girl Summer books, a vlog I will leave linked in the cards above if you haven't seen it. But this is a story of a woman in India who is dealing with the fact that her mother has developed dementia, although the doctors can't find any evidence of that on the scans, but her behaviour suggests that she is in the early stages of dementia. And this woman had a very difficult relationship with her mother, who throughout their childhood, so we flash back to her childhood where she was living in an ashram because the woman was involved in this kind of religious cult leader kind of situation, and then her relationship with another boyfriend in the future and how that affected the woman, and then also in the present day her dealing with the idea of potentially becoming a mother, and also of how you care for someone with whom you have such a fractious relationship, and how her family don't quite understand, like her husband, who is American born Indian, he doesn't quite grasp the intricacies of their relationship. And yeah, not a lot happens in this book. We just sort of see her life and them going about. The woman is also an artist, drawing the face of a man over and over again without looking at the picture that it started from, and there is this sort of sense of repetition and of focusing in on something, on small fine details, that is throughout the book, that it's really kind of unsettling and uncomfortable feeling when you read it, but not, I heard a lot of people talk about it as being very distant and very difficult. I didn't find that myself. We were really immersed in this woman's psychology and in her experience, and so you find yourself wondering, because other people are wondering how honest she's being, you find yourself wondering about the reliability of the narrator and what's being hidden and what's not being talked about. I found myself really wanting to know what happened and to feeling, like I said, very unsettled and uncomfortable, as if something terrible could happen at any moment. It is a book that doesn't need a lot of plot to pull you along, and I think that that's quite an impressive feat. Next we have The Betrayed by Rennie Okake Melvin. This is a proof. I'll put the actual cover here if you want to see what it looked like. And this is set in the Philippines, and it is about two sisters whose father was involved in the resistance to the Marcos regime, and he was killed in San Francisco, and they end up going back to the Philippines, and one of the sisters has married the godson of Ferdinand Marcos. And so it is told from the perspective of each of those sisters and the husband as they move through a summer in the Philippines where the new regime is taking over, and there have been 6 coup attempts, I think, over the course of this few months to overthrow the new regime. And it kind of explores politics in the region at the time and how the Marcos regime was overthrown, but things didn't really change. But really we are absorbed in these three characters. The husband is trying to get involved in politics. He comes from a political family, and the sisters, one is this very detached, very manipulative sister who's always thinking about her power and her control, but she's also pregnant and feels very like out of control. And then the other sister is a much more sort of lonely, melancholy character, and she is in love with her sister's husband. And so they travel around the Philippines to various different parts, and we see how the change in regime is affecting different parts of the Philippines. And the sister who is pregnant also sees ghosts, and so the ghosts and the haunting of history and the haunting of their own personal pasts and how those things affect their life is the themes. Again, lots of cyclical stuff, but it's really the setting and the vibe of the book that really pervades everything. It feels very hot and sticky and uncomfortable, and very like these characters are talking at cross purposes. They're not really talking to one another, and we see the ways that they keep making terrible decisions, but not a lot actually happens. But again, because of the political unrest that is kind of off the page, we feel that tension and the familial unrest as well, which again is not ever really expressed that straightforwardly. The tension and you can feel throughout. And like I said, the ghosts and the haunting, which for me is something that I've been really enjoying. This kind of ghosts more as a metaphor almost, ghosts not really present, never really doing anything active. Although there is a book in the future where there's a lot of ghosts that do things, but I really enjoyed this book. I don't think enough people have read it. I think that it's one that more people should pick up, and I really enjoyed it. Another one that I know lots of people love but some people really hate is The Vegetarian by Han Kang, and this is a novel that has been translated from Korean. It is about a woman who has really brutal dreams one night and decides to stop eating meat, but she keeps having these dreams that are really violent, and we see from the perspective of the people around her, never from her perspective herself, of what is happening to her as she slowly loses her grip on reality. It's a book where you could imagine there being a lot of plot and a lot of like shocking reveals, because a lot of shocking things do happen, but the way that they're played out is not as a linear plot or as something to be revealed. It's more just as very disconnected and disjointed, and it makes you feel really uncomfortable the whole time, but I found myself unable to stop reading and like really sort of morbidly curious. And I think that that's part of the point, because this book is a lot about possession that the different characters in her life feel towards her, and it's about her lack of her own agency and this sudden real detachment from the culture in which she's living allows her to do things that she wants to do and not to focus on the things that she's supposed to do and the pressure that is put on her from society. There is a lot about art and violence and cruelty and also nature, but in a really unsettling way, which I absolutely love. I love the discomfort that is very clearly present in this book. I think the vibes that I'm feeling in a lot of these books is a feeling of discomfort and a feeling of being removed from safety, and I really enjoy that in a book. I like a book that's that challenging, without it being inaccessible. So this is such a short little book that it manages to pack a big punch, and I think that's partly because it's such a short book. I think that it doesn't like overdraw out anything. You never really kind of know what's going on or what direction it's going to go in. and it manages to sustain that feeling of discomfort and that feeling of being unsafe. Like, you never feel like you're comfortable in this story, and I really enjoyed that. Then A Strange Story from Angola, and this is actually based on a true story, which I found kind of remarkable, although I think only loosely, because it's quite a strange book, as all of these books are. And this is A General Theory of Oblivion by Jose Eduardo Aguilusa, and this is set in Angola during the time of the fight for independence from the Portuguese, and it is based on a woman who leaves Portugal to move to Angola after a violent rape happens to her in Portugal, and she moves to Angola to live with her sister and her sister's husband. But then the fight for independence breaks out. Her sister and her husband flee back to Portugal with some diamonds, but our main character doesn't leave. She bricks herself instead into the apartment. But because of these diamonds, people keep coming to the apartment to try and find out what happened to the diamonds and where they have gone. So that sounds like it could be your typical kind of theft, heisty film, kind of crime novel. And we do spend a lot of time with organised crime in Angola, but it's not that straightforward at all. For a lot of the novel, we are bricked into an apartment with this woman as she spends 40 years, or I think 38 years, on her own in this apartment, and how she survives and what she's kind of hearing through the walls. And so it's very slow moving, and there's not a lot going on. We are just following her as she reads the books in the house, and as she finds food and like grows and cultivates her own food. And it is sort of her disconnect and her unawareness of what is going on in the world until a boy climbs up onto her balcony and brings the world as it is now into her life. And we also, as I said, follow sort of organised crime and the political machinations that are going on outside, but from a kind of remove again. So our characters are all peripheral characters rather than central to the plot, and I think that that's what allows it to be more the kind of broad vibe and the focus in on the everyday of a mundane person rather than the big events. So those big events kind of just brush past our characters. And there is a lot of strangeness. It's kind of almost magical realist. There's a singing pygmy hippopotamus, which I mention every time I talk about this book because I can't get that image out of my brain. But it is, yeah, it's a weird book where everything feels quite like still and slow and like darkly funny, and it isn't what you expect going in from the plot, I don't think, but I think that it is really well done. So I mentioned magical realism, and I do think that magical realism is a style that lends itself to these vibes, because the point of magical realism is that it is unreal things that happen, but our characters react to them as if they are perfectly normal and mundane, rather than fantastical. And so that lends itself to characters who aren't quite explaining what's going on, or to no one making a distance between the reader and the book. And the original famous piece of his magical realism is 100 Years of Solitude by Gabriel Garcia Marquez. And there was magical realism before them, but this is the most famous, I think. I do have a video about magical realism linked in the cards above if you want to learn more about the genre. But I really enjoyed this book despite it being so weird. Yes, there are very uncomfortable things that happen in it involving sex, incest and rape and stuff, so if those are things you don't want to read about, but I think it's kind of part of the unreality of the book. It's kind of slightly feels like a fairy tale, and it slightly feels like a myth. It feels actually quite a lot like a myth, and I think that you read those things in myth all the time and we don't apply the same morality to it. But this is set in a unnamed Latin American country over the course of several years through the Buendia family and their sort of descendants, and through the development of this country. We have these people trying to they found a city, and then the involvement of fights for independence, and also of like capitalist interest in their country and the way that it treats workers. It dives into a lot of different topics, but always from a kind of slightly strange outside-ish viewpoint. There's a moment where a mother finds that her son has been killed because the blood drips from his body and follows and dribbles through the whole town and into her house, and that's how she finds out. There are various other moments of fantastical that makes the world feel always slightly off kilter, and the other thing is that you're never quite sure where you are, because Garcia Marquez will jump forward in time in a chapter and then slowly work his way back to where you finished the last chapter, so you're always kept slightly off balance, and I think that's one of the things that is a theme of this video, is that books that keep you feeling on your toes in a way that you never feel safe or like you can trust the author, and I really enjoy that feeling. I think it's more challenging but more interesting to read. The other thing that he does to do that is that everyone has the same name. There are literally 37 characters with the exact same name. Oh no, maybe not 17. 18, 19, 21, 22. There are 22 characters called Aureliano in this book, so it is difficult to keep up with who everyone is. But again, like I said, I think it's books like this that are just vibes. You have to just let things happen. You can't be needing to grasp onto everything in the same way you would with a more plot focused or character focused book. You have to kind of just go with the flow, and it's that style of reading, I think, that really draws me to these books that are no plot, just vibes. Now, speaking as we were of ghost stories, one that has a lot more active ghosts than some of the others I have been talking about is Build Your House Around My Body by Violet Cooper Smith. And this is set in Vietnam, about the disappearance of two different women, two different time periods. So we are set in the late 80s, early 90s, about these three friends who live in a remote rural mountain town in Vietnam. And we know that the girl has gone missing, but we keep flashing back to the time that they spent together. And then we also have a girl who is Vietnamese American and has moved to Vietnam and is teaching English in a foreign language school, but she feels very disconnected and very like as if she's not sure what's going on. She doesn't feel like she's really like immersed in Vietnam, and she doesn't feel like anyone really knows where she is. There's a lot of like weird interactions with different men, particularly in Vietnam, and this book is a lot about male violence. And as we go further and further into the book, it gets weirder and weirder, and there are more ghosts, wet ghosts with hair. Hair is a big thing, because the flat in which our modern day woman is living has a dip in the flat, and she feels like there's something there that she's not sure what's going on. She keeps hearing things, and yeah, so this book does get quite supernatural and quite strange, but never in a way that's like explained, never in a way that has a resolution to it. Everything's just very strange and very dark. It's one of the more interesting books that I read last year. I really felt drawn to it. Again, a kind of sense of discomfort, a sense of never knowing what was going on, and a really vivid sense of setting of the forests in this mountain town in Vietnam, and of I think it's Ho Chi Minh City, not Hanoi, where she is. I think it's Ho Chi Minh City. The city really came to life in this book, and I really enjoyed that. I thought it was wonderfully immersive. Another piece of translated fiction where I think it just keeps you off kilter all the time is a book I read in 2020 and loved, and that is Summerlight and Then It Comes the Night by Jon Kalman Stephenson. This is almost like a series of interconnected short stories, although it is billed as a novel, and it's set in a small town in Iceland. I think most towns in Iceland are fairly small, but it's set in a small town in Iceland, and we just go through various different characters as they are experiencing life. But these are, again, I would say probably magical realist is the easiest genre to describe them as. They are kind of strange. There is a man who has painted the galaxy on his roof. There is something dark lurking in a storehouse, and it starts off very kind of light and funny, and then it gets darker and darker as we go further into winter, and as Iceland itself is becoming darker and darker, and then we escape out into the light again at the other end. It's about small communities where everyone knows everyone and everyone's watching you, everyone knows your history, and it is told from a collective we voice to kind of give you that feeling, and there is a sense of an omniscient narrator but who is a collective, which feels like, reminds me of a Greek chorus, but also reminds me of that nosiness, and all of these characters feel kind of suffocated almost, but also like they don't fit when they leave to go to Reykjavik or other larger places. It is a very still, slow-moving book in which characters don't really talk, and there is not a lot going on where you can really grasp characters. None of the characters, they feel kind of fantastical. They don't feel very grounded, but without actually being that magical. It's just, there's a feeling of unreality that I think pervades through the book, and through a lot of these books, because it's the vibe that I'm heading for. And I just really loved it. I thought it was so charming and funny and weird. A lot of weird sex stuff going on in this book, but in a way that I found kind of the disconnect really made that work for me. I really enjoyed it, and yeah, it's just a bizarre little book that I think more people should read. One that I know a fair few people have talked about is Braised Pork by Anne Yu, which is one of the earliest books I read on this channel, and I really found it very strange, and I didn't enjoy it as much as some of the other books on this list, but I feel like now that I've gotten into this style of book, I would have enjoyed it. I would enjoy it a lot more. And this is about a woman in Beijing whose husband has died, and he leaves a picture drawing of a man who is half man, half fish next to him, where he's found dead in the bathtub. And his wife is, there's some sense of that they were not really connected in their relationship, but she kind of doesn't know how to deal with his passing and becomes obsessed with this fish man and trying to discover what's going on. She ends up going to Tibet at some point, and she feels this kind of connection to this water world. There's a lot of water and fish and fire throughout this book, and the connections of those things. We see her stay with her aunt and her mother, and an aquarium catches fire at some point. Women's place in Beijing, and how difficult it is when a husband passes away for a woman to survive, her lack of her own access to resources and her difficulty working when she was married and things like that, which are very interesting topics, but they are just kind of going on in the background. It's another book with a lot of art. Our main character is an artist, and she is asked to paint a mural at some point, and she keeps going off into this kind of water world, and nothing is ever explained. It's all very strange and disconnected, disjointed, and a book where nothing happens. It just feels you just kind of have to immerse yourself in this world that feels so uncomfortable, and that is kind of the whole theme of the book. Our main characters feel so unsettled that it's a book that never really lets you settle either. Then the final book on my list is probably the plottiest one, and that is The Mercies by Kieran Millward Hargrave. So this is another piece of historical fiction set in Norway, 17th century, about an island where a lot of the men have died in a fishing accident, and so the women are trying to fend for themselves. But the King of Denmark, who owns Norway at this point, is really concerned about witches, and so he sends a kind of clergyman up north to find out what's going on, and to kind of spy on these women and discover what's happening and how they are surviving. And it is another book set in a small town with a lot of characters that are feeling very like they're watching one another and they're becoming aware of strange things they're doing. It is a book where the church plays a big role, and our guy who comes up from the south, he brings a new woman with him, and how she kind of interacts with the small town is a big part of it as well. It's a book where everyone again is watching one another, and where everything that happens so small, in such small moments. Like there's a flatbread making scene that's really pivotal to the plot. Everything, whilst there is a plot, whilst there is something that's happening, and kind of witch hunts are a big part of it, and so there is that powering the narrative. It isn't the central focus of the narrative. It's a much smaller and closer book that's focusing in on relationships and the psychology and of this small town, the feeling of being watched and being uncomfortable, which I really love. I think that this one probably has more fleshed out characters than a lot of the others. I think there are characters you can really root for, so if that's something you want in a book, then I think this one would probably work the most for you out of all of them. But overall, I think it's just a really lovely book, even though there is so much darkness in it. It is kind of another one with a really compelling feeling to it, a kind of feeling of discomfort that I find personally very compelling to read. The 10 books that I really love the vibes of, weird, dark, unsettling books that I absolutely have fallen in love with. If you have any books that you feel like fit this genre, do let me know in the comments down below. And if you are looking for more, I will leave a couple of videos here where I talk about this sort of thing. I think I'll put one vlog and one recommendations, so you can have a look and see. And please do let me know what you thought in the comments down below. I would love to hear from you. I try to put out new videos twice a week, so I will be back again very soon. So do subscribe if you haven't already, and give this video a like. Thank you for watching. Bye bye!